Who amongst us recalls the merry dance that poor old Severus Snape was led with that girl whose death we had the pleasure to witness a few moments ago? The Death Eaters chattered amongst themselves, the muttering low, until one of them shouted above the others. Yes, in school. Peter Pettigrew had moved further towards the group, looking at Cecilia with bulging eyes. "Ah, Wormtail," said Voldemort, holding out his arm as if to introduce Cecilia to Pettigrew. The man took a step towards her, looking Snape's body up and down. "Perhaps you could continue with the explanation?" he suggested, an amused smile playing on his lips. "Certainly, my lord," continued Pettigrew, and Cecilia returned his unmoving stare with one of her own. Sirius Black used to go out with Henrietta Edwards, although she had a soft spot for why Snape. She felt sorry for him. "Ah yes," lamented Voldemort, "the curse of the mole. Sympathy." Pettigrew flashed his eyes to his master before gazing at Cecilia. "Yes, yes." And Snape took it for affection. At the word, Pettigrew's eyes became wilder with excitement, and some of the Death Eaters behind her sniggered. But then he found out she was a Mole-born, and told the Dark Followers and arranged to bring her to the Shrieking Shack, where we intended for her to be his initiation. A shadow fell across Cecilia's face. From what she recalled from Minerva's memory, Snape had told Dumbledore he was about to propose to her. She felt her body grow colder as she compared Henrietta's situation to her own. Miss Edwards's death was delayed by 9 years, but no matter. It came. Voldemort fixed his eyes deliberately on Cecilia. "Yours, however, is delayed by a mere 9 weeks, for once you have given us the information you shall die." Before Cecilia had a chance to move her hand to her pocket, a voice, like a silk ribbon, rustled by her shoulder. "Silly girl," it said, and immediately Cecilia recognized the voice. "Don't think about running." Cecilia gasped as Lucius Malfoy was standing right by her, and grabbed her arms, and she staggered back. He leaned forward so his mouth was very close to her ear. "The things he had in mind for the both of you, oh yes indeed." Instinctively, Cecilia began to struggle, and Malfoy gripped her arms tighter, swinging her around by the shoulder so that she faced his mask. Gritting her teeth, Cecilia stepped forward heavily onto his foot, and he yelled, throwing her onto the ground roughly and raising his wand. "But it's Voldemort who needs to curse me," Cecilia's brain screamed at her. "Nothing else matters." "Lucius, my faithful friend," Voldemort looked across at Malfoy, shaking his head disapprovingly as his voice became a sing-song lilt. "Is this how we treat our guests? It won't do at all. Help our guest to her feet, Lucius. She may feel more." Voldemort looked directly at Cecilia now. Obliging. Roughly, Malfoy gripped her arms and pulled her hastily up. Around them Cecilia realized that the Death Eaters had become more compact, standing in an arc around her and Voldemort. "Mrs. Frobisher, tell us what this means." Voldemort thrust the book in front of Cecilia's face, and she scanned the first page of it. The group was silent now, watching with bated breath as Cecilia looked up from the book and then shook her head. "This will help loosen her tongue, my lord," declared Lucius Malfoy, and he bunched up Snape's hair, pushing her onto her knees. Still gripping her hair, Cecilia screwed up her eyes as Malfoy pulled back Snape's head. In the moonlight, Cecilia could just make out the word Veritaserum on the bottle and realized that it had been the same one that Malfoy had force-fed to Snape almost an hour ago. Cecilia clenched her teeth shut, childishly. If they were about to pry information from her, she was not going to give in lightly. "Open wide, Mrs. Frobisher," encouraged Lucius Malfoy, mockingly as he tilted back her head with Snape's hair as he had done with Snape himself. The clear liquid tasted of nothing, but the angle of her head made her cough and choke. As the liquid flowed down her esophagus and into her stomach, something akin to a light switch flicked on in Cecilia's head, and she felt the cares of the last 2 months slip away out of her mind. Coughing again, She looked around as Voldemort fixed his hot coal-like eyes on her. But the questions did not emanate from him but from Malfoy who, it appeared to Cecilia in her more focused state of mind, had his own agenda. Shaking her to her feet, Malfoy stood in front of Cecilia bearing a look of triumph. "So answer me, Mul. My son told me you were interested in potions and he has been feeding information to us about the squib in the school. How was it that you were able to convince him that you were a squib? Answer me," he declared. "I did not tell him," said Cecilia flatly. Malfoy stepped back, crestfallen. Behind him, the Death Eater whom Cecilia had heard Voldemort address as Bella stepped forward, like a miniature Rottweiler, snarling behind her mask. But her wrath did not fall on Cecilia. Instead she turned and spoke to Malfoy. "I told you he had no staying power. That's the young these days. I warned you not to trust Draco, Lucius. That is my sister's influence. He's soft." She turned from Malfoy sharply and glared at Cecilia through her mask. "And you want to educate them? I don't know how you can." "Actually," replied Cecilia pedagogically, looking Lucius Malfoy, "he is very intelligent young man, it's just a shame he can't use it for something productive." She broke off as Malfoy glowered at her. "Draco just isn't living up to his potential in blood," Bellatrix Lestrange continued. "There's no loyalty with the young." She glanced accusingly at other Death Eaters who, to Cecilia's surprise, shied away at her stare. "The young have lost interest now. At their age we were ready to fight for the family, for power. We would have done it for the glory." A few of the others appeared to echo Bellatrix's words and nodded in agreement. "Enough, Bella," declared Voldemort, and he turned from the deference of his most faithful follower to Cecilia, his voice changing from instruction to unveiled menace. "There's no escape, Mrs. Frobisher, not for you nor for Dumbledore's order, who are going to find us very powerful indeed." His tone of voice changed to mocking concern. "You do not have the weapon and would not use it if you had, so you will tell us what we need to know." "On the contrary, Voldemort," Cecilia shot back, her mind urging her on, knowing she would be compelled to answer truthfully, as she had done when Sirius Black had given Veritaserum to her and she reached into her pocket for the potion. "On the contrary," she repeated, feeling her mind cloud with uncertainty, "the weapon is very close at hand and in perfect working order. I only need to give the signal dash." "No!" Bellatrix Lestrange screamed and began to make her way fearlessly towards Cecilia. Voldemort raised an arm in her direction and she stopped in mid-step, as if petrified. "No, Bella. Perhaps it is time we are a little more persuasive in our request." Raising his arms outwards, his wand aloft, looked at Cecilia, who was still on her knees. "Our guest should, I feel, have a taste of what will happen to the Mul-born children in the castle. Perhaps then she will be better informed to make her decision." Swiftly he motioned towards Lucius Malfoy, who raised his wand. "Cura in potentia. 88,888,888. Your father would be so proud." A couple of 100 yards away from the Death Eaters, Ron Weasley placed a worn and scruffy trainer-shod foot on Draco Malfoy's chest, taking care to press down hard. "He was a governor, wasn't he, Malfoy? He'll approve of you destroying classrooms and stealing." From Draco's firm grasp Ron wrestled a copy of Magic and Moles and held it up. The silver letters shone in the moonlight, and Ron grinned at him, pressing his foot down harder on his chest as the Slytherin student and potential junior Death Eater struggled to get free. "I'm warning you, Weasley," he growled, though not quite as menacingly as Ron had heard before. He stopped as Ron gave him a grin, stowing away Cecilia's book inside his robe. "You'll what? Call for Crabbe and Goyle? Well, I don't think they'll hear you somehow from this distance, seeing as Flint was taking them back to your common room. Listen," added Ron dramatically. Malfoy wriggled under Ron's foot again and Ron pressed down harder again as he tilted his head in the direction of the Death Eaters. He turned back to Draco and grinned mockingly. "Did you hear that, Malfoy? A mole just called you intelligent." He laughed at Draco's discomfort. "And there you are, stealing her things," he added, shaking the book at him. To his surprise, Draco turned his head away from Ron. "My FF," he began. Snape," he stuttered. Yes, we know your father is a foul wizard too," began Ron. He broke off quickly however when he heard what sounded like someone calling his name. Under his foot, Malfoy struggled to get away and he got to his feet triumphantly. Ron turned quickly and balled up his fist before Draco had a chance to say anything, and threw it in his direction, knocking him out. "Ron! I can't believe you've just done that." Behind him Hermione stood, her hands to her mouth in shock. "It was clearly self-defense," replied Ron, folding his arms proudly. "He would have got me otherwise." But although Hermione nodded in apparent agreement, it was an absent gesture and Ron turned to look where she was now pointing, at the scene ahead. 88,888,888. Hanging her head Cecilia could clearly see Malfoy raising his wand. Did she have enough time, she wondered? It would cause some damage, at least. Perhaps if she just raised her arm. Maybe this was the signal they needed. Cecilia reached into her pocket as the torture curse hit her in the chest. She screamed in agony as the blue-white lightning seemed to crawl over Snape's body like an electrified tarantula. Pain like nothing she had ever felt before seemed to be crushing every inch of her body. At the same time the blood flowing through her capillaries felt as if it had been set alight, scorching every cell its path. Simultaneously the joints in the body felt as if it is being ripped apart with some great force pulling agonizingly at her tendons and sinews. She did not know how long Malfoy had cursed her. It could have been a few seconds or a few days. Biting her lip she willed herself not to share her pain with those around her. But it didn't matter. Around her laughter and even applause told Cecilia that they had clearly enjoyed the spectacle. "Enough," she heard Voldemort's cold tone address Lucius Malfoy. "Now the mole understands the power of wizards. She will come to the correct decision in due course." Cecilia barely registered the lack of curse penetrating her body and she lay on the floor, cold perspiration bespangling her brow as she panted painfully, every breath as painful as the last. Around her the disparaging remarks, those she had been witness to and overheard, those dismissing moles as parasites and inferior. And in the back of her mind Cecilia's consciousness compelled her to speak, to tell them what they wanted to know. For what they wanted to know was counterintuitive to their inner beliefs. And with supreme effort Cecilia Frobisher forced herself onto her knees, still panting and dripping in sweat. The Death Eaters fell silent as she made Snape's body stand to its full height. "I will tell you everything, Voldemort," she began, looking into his gaunt, grey face. "Starting with Dash." With more concerted effort Cecilia turned to face Malfoy. "Your family motto. It was supposed to mean power in the blood, not power upon bloodshed, not like you believe." A glimmer of satisfaction built on Cecilia's confidence and she drew Snape's lips into a twisted smile. "Your ancestor Joseph Black changed it. But he couldn't alter the true meaning." Dash. "You lie!" screamed Bellatrix, flying in Cecilia's direction. "You lie, this is not the interpretation." In protest, she tore her death mask from her face and Cecilia was met with a face that she recognized, like the woman she had seen in the picture in Draco Malfoy's room, her face thin and her features twisted. A dozen years ago she would have been beautiful but now her eyes were so hollow. "She cannot lie," whispered Malfoy, "she has taken Snape's own Veritaserum." Staggering to plant her feet more firmly onto the ground Cecilia reached into her pocket and held the potion tightly in her hand again. "There is a man buried in a church in London by the name of James what?" The inscription on his tomb is there for all to see. She smiled inwardly at the growing confusion she was now beginning to instill in some of them. Power. That he gave power to the people. Power to us moles. And Joseph Black hated him for it. Now she was addressing the Death Eaters, as if educating a group of school children, as if lecturing to adults. All were silent, still. All were wordless. She had them under her spell, for they believed in their own magic and they trusted her words. Just then, Voldemort's voice broke the spell, his voice as icy and cold as she remembered it when she was hiding behind the rock. And it is through this power that moles have ruined the world, with their power and lust for energy. It is because of you the righteous people cannot walk on this earth, live in a veritable Eden of tranquility. I can see into your mind, little mole, I can see that you agree with me. Not entirely. Cecilia turned her head slowly to Voldemort. For wizards are only marginally different to moles, but through evolution. Evolution. Voldemort scorned softly. Without the power that what gave moles you would have died out, because of evolution. Then power would be rested with wizards and there would be no moles. Like parasites running around, contaminating the world. 88,888,888. Oh, change over, said Bertie Griffin, nudging Bathsheba Bradle, getting to his feet. You're with Arthur and Tunks now, he added, and I'm with Sirius and Kingsley. Sturgis is with Mad Eye and Charlie, he added, breathing an inner sigh of relief. Watcher, said Tunks, looking at Bathsheba before walking back to the next hiding spot, behind huge bushy trees that blocked their way perfectly. Arthur followed on, hastening his pace a little. Just then, a blot of blue-white light illuminated the Death Eaters, making him jump. Steady, Arthur, said Bathsheba, patting Arthur Weasley on the shoulder, looking questioningly at Sturgis and Kingsley who rolled their eyes in acknowledgement. What is he doing? Tunks, who had turned to look at the now silent scene beyond them, muttered distantly in Bertie's direction. The short, bearded wizard turned quickly and looked at her, shrugging. Looks like he's begging for his life to me, he replied, returning to stare through the shrubbery that concealed them from the border. Snivelling cowardly git, commented Sirius at once. Looks to me like he's telling them about Cecilia, continued Bertie, as Arthur Weasley continued his slow pace in the wake of Tunks and Bathsheba. But they already know, said Kingsley, shaking his head and casting a glance in the direction of the Death Eaters. I just don't understand why he hasn't given the sign yet. Crouching behind the shrubbery, Kingsley Shacklebolt glared at Snape, holding his head defiantly in Voldemort's direction. Come on, Snape, give the sign. The rest of the wizards also began to stare out, with the exception of Sirius who looked across to another group. As one from it began to move he got to his feet and followed him. What do you mean, he? Mad-Eye Moody, his wooden leg and gnarled stick crept next to the watching wizards and he too began to watch what was happening. The wizards looked at him intermittently, vaguely wondering what Mad-Eye Moody was talking about before looking out on the scene again, watching the Death Eaters draw themselves close around Snape, who appeared to be muttering to himself. What do you mean? What do you mean, he, Alastair? Asked Arthur Weasley turned to Moody and frowning in incomprehension. That's Cecilia Frobisher out there, Alastair Moody clarified, looking at her with his dynamic eye. Arthur Weasley continued to frown before, all at once, his face washed with realization at what the retired Rare was saying. C. Cecilia Frobisher? He asked in alarm as Kingsley and Sturgis turned at Moody's words. Merlin's beard. Didn't you know? Asked Alastair slowly. I thought that was part of the plan. Before Arthur Weasley could reply, Tunks tapped him on the shoulder, her hand pointing at the Auror that was running towards them. Wilkins? What are you doing here? You were supposed to be on guard duty at the school. Tunks's voice trailed off as she stared at Bellum Wilkins, an aging Auror who was breathing bronchitically. "I've been relieved. Dumbledore sent me to join the second formation with Mad Eye," he gasped, nodding towards Moody reverentially. Alastor Moody's eye swiveled in its socket, returning the acknowledgement. "Ministry Aurors are here. Dumbledore's briefing them. 88,888,888. For the first time since he had materialized, Voldemort moved from his position underneath the dark mark. Cecilia thought he resembled a blue-gray ghost, gliding forwards and gazing on her as she stood before him, holding Harry's potion in her hand again. "The book," he insisted. "Speak, Mole." For a moment, Cecilia said nothing. She looked at the book and back to Voldemort, his red-hot eyes flaring, and she bit her treacherous tongue that would tell him. Her inaction was too much for some of the Death Eaters, and they began to grow restless from their positions behind her. "Many," she said eventually, narrowing her eyes. "He needs to do it now," she thought. "He needs to destroy me." Enough. Behind her, Bellatrix Lestrange pushed forward again, her wand angled towards Cecilia and her eyes bright. "Are we not going to end this, my lord? I can get the Mole to reveal the secret." "The secret," thought Cecilia. "Is that all that is preventing you from killing me? The link between moles and wizards?" She watched as Voldemort turned his head to Bellatrix and appeared to contemplate her offer. "Indeed, Bellepha, she is indeed weak. But I fear that your persuasion will not be as gentle." He glanced at Lucius Malfoy before back to Bellatrix, as that of Lucius. "I need her intact, at least for a little while." Now he turned towards Cecilia, "until I have the secret, the link." "What are you going to do with the information once I give it to you?" she demanded, knowing that it sounded foolish. Around her the Death Eaters began to laugh mockingly. Voldemort looked at them, engaging in the joke as he nodded at each of them knowingly. "I will destroy it, as I have done with your life, little Mole. For what stands before me is merely the empty shell that was once a soul." He broke off as Cecilia smiled widely. "No," she said simply, turning to the Death Eaters and declaring her defiance loudly again to them. "Torture her!" screamed Bellatrix, raising her wand again. "She is a weak and powerless Mole. She will tell all." At her demand for retribution, Voldemort remained silent and Cecilia held up her arm. "He dares not do that, Bellatrix. Is it?" Cecilia said, turning to the witch and smiling again as Bellatrix Lestrange blanched at her use of her name. "He knows that I have something here that will destroy him." Cecilia turned to Voldemort, speaking as loudly as she could manage. "And how ironic it is that the connection you seek was the very foundation upon which this potion was created that will, when it meets the cells in your body, Voldemort, cause all your energy to ebb away, leaving you powerless." She turned and addressed Bellatrix again. "So your version of power will no longer apply, yet mine will." And he is frightened. At her last sentence Cecilia turned towards Voldemort, gripping the vial in her fist, and as she did so her bravery evaporated as Voldemort raised himself taller and pointing his wand at Cecilia in silent fury. "You act brave, Mole, in your new skin, standing before me holding your weapon. Yet I smell the fear in you. And you will die for it." Without warning, Voldemort swiped his wand through the air, pointing it down towards the ground before Cecilia had a chance to react, and she gasped, terrified, as it moved. Avada Kedavra. A flash of green light followed, and all eyes, both those close and further away, fixed on the curse's target. It was worse than the pictures Cecilia had seen of Tonks's, worse even than the curse performed in her own dream or the animals Snape had slain in pursuit of the potion. Her heart began to slow to a dull, solid beat, as if it was requesting forgiveness for disturbing her thoughts. Cecilia had seen the face of Oswald T. Avery Jr., the failed Death Eater, turn from amused animation at the thought of her own impending doom, slowly and steadily to a mask of terror, slumping to the dew-sodden ground as the green light of the killing curse flooded his body, penetrating it, making the energy leave his body, inhibiting the metabolic processes in each organ, each tissue, each cell. She could not hide the horror in her face now, and in her pancreas she felt the adrenaline began to surge. Why aren't they coming, she thought desperately. What are they waiting for? And then around her, the Death Eaters as one looked towards their master. Cecilia turned and steeled herself, knowing that her turn to meet Avery's fate lay very close. Curling her hand around the potion again, she too looked at Voldemort. Bellatrix raised her wand towards Cecilia. Before I die, you need to know the truth, Voldemort, about what you are up against, for you will not succeed. Her voice was beginning to grow thin as she spoke, the familiar effects of the potions that she had imbibed now beginning to take their toll. Voldemort nodded, indicating that Bellatrix should lower her wand, and Cecilia held her head aloft, taking a few steps backwards. Behind her she felt a wand in the small of her back and hot breath on her neck. Ignoring Malfoy, she pressed on. Cecilia gave in to the speech she felt compelled to make before her silent assassins, trying to suppress the hysterical laughter that was forcing her to grin wildly. The plain fact is that you, together, are an accident of genetics. A rogue gene made wizards what they are, evolving from moles. And you know it too. Cecilia smirked, the words spilling from her mouth like groceries from a broken shopping bag. Which is why your plans are what they are. She grinned stupidly again. And why you think like you do. And why it will not work. And what do you have planned? Voldemort leaned towards Cecilia, his voice like gravestones grating together. You know that if carry out your plan, and all that you hope for comes to pass, then you will die. No mole would die voluntarily. You do not have the courage. Under the glare of Voldemort's powerful and dreadful presence, Cecilia stood to Snape's full height, looking him full in his face. This wizard wasn't something to fear, she told herself. He was a protein molecule or two different, that was all. Oh, you have a lot to learn about moles, she retorted tenaciously, because when you have seen over the edge of despair like I have, Voldemort, you know there's not much you wouldn't do to put one bit of goodness back. Then let us show you how close it can be. Behind her, Lucius Malfoy grabbed Cecilia's clothes at under her chin and tearing at her clothes as he threw her to the ground. Since it was Snape's body, what was exposed from the torn fabric in Malfoy's hand was dark and hairy, and Malfoy stood above her, holding her at one point. You really didn't think your actions would go unnoticed, Cecilia Frobisher? He sneered, pulling off his mask and glaring at her with stone-grey eyes. Your foray into Gringotts and the book you dropped. The bewitched book that you took instead of the one that Snape gave you, through which your secrets were no longer safe. Without warning, Malfoy raised his wand and simultaneously kicked her heavily in the ribs. Cecilia rolled to her right and curled her knees up to her chest involuntarily. But Lucius had not finished with her. He pulled her up to her feet, holding her so she faced Voldemort and angled her head towards his lord. How weak, mocked Voldemort, his voice thin and ethereal. How pathetic. How ironic that your kind has destroyed the planet. Everything that you do is for your own selfish means, to strive and dominate. And that doesn't sound too much different from your aims. Cecilia could feel her voice growing thinner and she bit her lip, gripping the potion as she tried to focus. Stay alert. Stay alert. I can sense the fear in you, Mole. You are terrified in my presence. I have the weapon, Voldemort, she began, panting for breath. Just at that moment, Lucius Malfoy gripped her tight around her waist and she pulled against it, sinking her teeth into his shoulder. He loosened his grip and Cecilia pulled away, opening her right hand to reveal the blue glowing potion within her palm. You! Malfoy screamed, but then stopped as Cecilia closed her hand and held it a little higher, swallowing and inhaling deeply. To her surprise, Voldemort began to laugh, his deep, punctuations of mirth hitting her ears like Barnes Wallis bouncing bombs. Snape works for me, Mole. He brought you here and the weapon. Cecilia turned defiantly to Voldemort, narrowing her eyes. Who do you choose to believe, Voldemort, Snape, who has collaborated with me on this every step of the way, or me, who your faithful sheep has force-fed a truth potion? Do you think I did not account for this? Do you think Snape has not merely been carrying out my orders? If that were true, Cecilia spat back, then you would not look so scared. I made this myself. I know its effects, and it will destroy you. Science has known to be wrong. I had Severus, Cecilia replied weakly. I know him. She coughed. Around her now things were becoming hazy. Concentrate. Concentrate. Severus. Voldemort rolled Snape's name around, as if savoring it with relish. You have feelings for him. You care for him. Around her she could hear a ripple of laughter, and against the icy breeze that was flicking through the trees Cecilia felt herself blush. But you care more for another. It is satisfying to see what the wizard world has done to you, Mole, leaving you hopeless, despairing, with nothing to live for. At his words of truth now, Cecilia felt herself shudder. The ball is in your court, Voldemort, she said, looking at him directly. It's me you answer to now, she added to herself as she saw him eye the potion, with just a mere flicker of hesitation pass over his grotesque features. Then around her the atmosphere seemed to stop still, the air seeming to lull to nothing as she stood, an insignificant person before a wizard so powerful. A brave and clever scientist before an arrogant freak of nature. Never have I heard such insolence, my lord. Bellatrix Lestrange, her determination to attack Cecilia overcoming her. Raising her wand she sent a bolt of light towards Cecilia, hitting her under her ribs. She staggered, but kept her balance, flicking the cork from the end of the vial and placing her finger over the neck. Leave her, commanded Voldemort, snarling at Bellatrix. The Mole is mine to deal with as I see fit. At last thought Cecilia, a grain of hope entering her mind. You need to kill me now, Voldemort. Instead, he threw mysterious mythology at her and she watched it fall to the damp earth. The stories. What do they mean? They are science stories. But it is not Freya's. It is a copy, an illusion. What are they for? To allow understanding for the intellectually challenged. At her last insult, Lucius Malfoy kicked her swiftly in the region of Snape's kidneys. She sank to the floor. But that was the least of her concern. Cecilia barely felt the assault. Her eyesight was growing dull and the sight of Voldemort raising his wand in her direction looked out of focus and far away. Towering above her, the most powerful wizard in the world stood above Cecilia Frobisher, holding his arms aloft in a V as he glowered over his followers. I have to admit, Mole, that small part of me admires your foolish courage to face me. I do not recall one of your kind attempting that before. You have been an excellent sport and useful to our cause. And now, Cecilia Frobisher, you will die. Avada. Their words trailed off into the distance and Cecilia opened her hand, summoning what little strength she had left to aim the potion at Voldemort. But he had not spoken. Instead, he'd turned and was looking in the direction of Hogwarts. So were the rest of the Death Eaters. Hastily, Cecilia scrambled to her feet, trying to ascertain whence the voice had arisen in the darkness, and she tightened her finger so hard over the neck of the vial she was sure it would leave a bruise. Avada. The voice, louder now, reverberated around the clearing, past the Death Eaters and around Voldemort. Now Cecilia could see that there was a figure, small for it was still far away, running towards them. She recognized the voice. Cecilia held her fist aloft, turning to face Voldemort. At the same time as she prepared to throw it, felt as though the forest around them had erupted violently into action. She turned at a shriek that pierced the sky, missing her target as Harry ran past her. Dropping the bottle, Cecilia turned painfully and ran, her head dizzy as the potion seeped into the grass. Behind her she left the confusion, as she scrambled back up the steep bank down which she had walked so bravely almost half an hour ago. Behind her explosions of light and sound cacophonized the clearing which was now alive with the Order of the Phoenix. Spells were cast haphazardly as wizards on both sides launched into battle. But this did not concern Cecilia now as ahead of her she spied the rock where she had hidden earlier, its cool surface beckoning her hot, lethargic body. Just up there she could rest. Just up there she could sleep. The roar of battle behind her now increased in ferocity as Cecilia stumbled over the scarp slope. Underneath her hands the rough nodules of a near-buried rock scratched away at her epidermis as she fell towards it, slumping onto her stomach, and then she felt a hand on her shoulder, pulling at her clothing. "Get off!" Cecilia tried to scream the words and allay the hand on her shoulder, but now her strength had waned. Now she was done for. Now she had failed. Now she would die. "Mrs. Frobisher, it's me," declared Ron, pulling her out of sight of the Death Eater who, by the light of the silvery moon, saw her illuminated and an easy target, and a bolt of yellow light narrowly missed her foot. "Mrs. Frobisher." Cecilia looked up, her mind racing. She had not planned for what she should do when she got away from the Death Eaters and Voldemort, for it had not been her intention to do so. Muzzily she inched towards the rock, feeling sweat flood her face, and she put her cheek towards the rock. "Mrs. Frobisher, you have to get away," Ron continued urgently, looking past the rock and at the Death Eaters who had clocked where she had gone. "Come on," he demanded. "You've got to try. I can't leave him." He indicated to the unconscious Draco Malfoy. Nodding, Cecilia gripped Ron's forearm and with supreme effort he hauled Snape's large frame up to its feet as Cecilia pressed her soles to the ground. Behind them, footsteps were beginning to thud louder on the ground as pursuers approached quickly. "Come on," urged Ron, "not far." He nodded in the direction of the Forbidden Forest. Weakly Cecilia staggered, upon treacherous ground that appeared to slip away under her feet. When they had got 50 yards, a couple of trees deep, Ron finally let go of her arm, dropping Malfoy to the ground with a bump. "You'll be safe here," he reassured Cecilia hastily as she sank to her knees. "Safe." Cecilia ran the word over in her mind. Safe. Ron, however, was looking past Cecilia, at the figure just behind her. His face wrinkled in anticipatory fear and he gestured in Cecilia's direction. "She took the potion, Professor," he gabbled frantically, and Minerva McGonagall stopped her determined pursuit of another wayward student, glancing at Severus Snape's buckled form before narrowing her eyes in Ron's direction. "Your brothers, Mr. Weasley, Fred, and George," she clarified authoritatively, "have taken Mrs. Frobisher to the hospital." She turned her austere gaze from her errant student to her erratic colleague. "Severus, I think you should get back there yourself." "But Professor," Ron began to argue as McGonagall swished her tartan robe over her shoulder, but Cecilia placed her hand on his forearm and he fell silent. "And as for you, Mr. Weasley and, Mr. Malfoy," Minerva McGonagall assertively, "both of you shall remain here until I return. Then I shall escort you, both," she glanced uncertainly at Draco, "back to the safety of the school." With that, she turned heel and hurried down through the trees in the direction of the rising battle. "Mrs. Frobisher," whispered Ron uncertainly as he stood over her, "that is you, isn't it?" Cecilia nodded weakly, gripping Ron's arm, and pulled him towards her. "Ron. Harry." Her frantic thoughts bounced and flitted round her mind as she tried to vocalize her thoughts into comprehensible sentences. "Why did he take it?" she demanded. "I said, it wasn't not perfect. I said, wasn't done." Pulling on his arm, she pushed herself into a sitting position, her waxen face illuminated ghoulishly in the moonlight. helping her carefully. Ron looked at her, glancing past her shoulder briefly before looking at Snape's face. "I don't think we can do anything about it now," he began, pausing as he registered her words. "Mrs. Frobisher," he began again, "not perfect. But you made it, using Harry's mum's sample. It's perfect." His voice trailed off as Cecilia gripped his sleeve, pulling him towards her. "No," she whispered, coughing roughly and trying to focus on Ron's confused face, and she reached into her pocket, pulling out the small piece of brown pottery that she had taken from the Godric's Hollow crime scene almost a month ago. "This is all I took, nothing of Lily Potter's DNA. I never intended for Harry to take it. Even with the sample it would have." Cecilia inhaled raggedly. "Been too dangerous." Her voice trailed off and she closed her eyes briefly, the noise from the battle growing in her ears, despite their distance from it now. Ron took a few steps away from Cecilia, looking in its direction, his hand to his mouth. "Then Harry's going to die." He looked back down at Cecilia before glancing back up. In his view he saw what he thought he had seen just a few minutes ago. The figure took a few steps towards them, smiling weakly at Ron. "Professor? I mean, Lupin?" "Remus," thought Cecilia, her heart beginning to beat faster. With difficulty she turned her head and opened her eyes, looking at his beautiful features picked out in the dulled moonlight. He wasn't looking himself, thought Cecilia. He wasn't well. His face was far paler than usual and his eyes bloodshot. "Remus," she tried, but Ron spoke first. "Harry's taken the potion, Professor. Professor Snape." He gestured to Cecilia on the ground. "He's taken the potion too." "What?" Remus shot a look in Cecilia's direction, disbelief mixed with accusation. "Snape, you let him do that? You fool. You idiot." He took an angry step towards Cecilia and she narrowed her eyes. "I couldn't stop him," she gasped, giving a passable imitation of Snape as she got shakily to his feet. "Impetuous boy," she added, trying to mean it as she stared at Remus, her breathing labored. "I encouraged him," said Ron, looking between Remus and Cecilia. "It wasn't Professor Snape," he added loyally. "Now if you'll excuse me," she continued, looking away from Remus, "I'll just be," but Remus was too quick for her, and for Ron, who was a second too slow to stand between Remus and Cecilia. "No you don't," he shouted, catching Cecilia roughly by the shoulders as she made to stagger away. "Not until we've had a little chat." Releasing a hand from her left shoulder, Remus delved into his cloak and withdrew his wand. Ron opened his mouth to say something and then caught Cecilia's glare. "Mr. Weasley," she began, focusing on Ron and ignoring Remus. "Potter's in danger. You've got to warn the Order somehow. Make someone listen to you, Minerva. Dumbledore. They'll be able to do something. Do you understand?" Ron looked hastily between Cecilia and Remus, nodding mutely as another shadow began to pass over their lunar spotlight. She looked back at Lupin, who had lowered his wand and was now staring at her with an expression of fixed hysteria. "Mrs. Frobisher," whispered Ron, staring at Lupin. "Cecilia," he added. At her name, she turned to him and tried to assume her best teacher stare. "Ron, get out of here," she ordered, flicking her head painfully in the direction of the battle. "You need to go." But Ron was not listening to her and she turned her head to look where he was staring. "Cecilia?" Remus whispered her name quietly as Ron continued to fix his stare on him. She nodded instinctively. "Get out of here." As he spoke, the clouds that were masking the full moon began to part and Cecilia watched Ron's face fill with horror. "Ron," she began, "what's the," but his sentence remained unsaid as her mouth fell open. Behind Lupin, Sirius Black appeared. "So, Remus, what do we have here?" He looked at Cecilia disparagingly before noticing that she was not alone. "Ron, what are you doing here?" Before anyone could answer, Ron pointed in the direction of the now exposed moon, bereft of any decency that the clouds could offer it, and Sirius's face turned from mocking scorn to horrified shock as he followed a young wizard's gesture. Cecilia glanced the two before returning to the now sickening expression of Lupin, who was scanning the sky frantically, which had now beclothed the moon with other clouds as quickly as it had deprived it of the others. What was going on? She asked silently, slipping underfoot and staggering past Ron as she tried to work it out. Turning from his analysis of the moon, Sirius turned and stared at Cecilia. "Snivellus," he declared loudly, taking a step towards Cecilia. "Running away from things yet again, you cowardly, pathetic half-blood wizard, you?" Shocked, Cecilia glanced down before looking sharply at Ron. "Go now. Do as I say." She glared at Ron, who was now looking desperately between the three adults before him. "How dare you speak to him in that manner?" Sirius took a few murderous steps towards Snape's body. "Have you never wondered, Snivellus, why you are so unpopular? It is that manner that fails to endear yourself to people. You cannot just treat people like that." But his words were beginning to wash over Cecilia's head now, and she backed against the tree again, sliding down its rough branches. "Ron. For Harry's sake. Your best friend. Leave me and save him. Go." Without another word, Ron stepped over the still unconscious form of Draco, grabbing his arm in his wake and dragging him roughly over the rocky ground as he sped from them and deeper into the forest. And now, Sirius approached Cecilia further, and he stepped past his friend, focusing on her his glare. Remus held out his arm, grabbing his friend his robe sleeve. "This is it, Sirius," he whispered, and Cecilia looked at his face that had grown paler and more sickly than before. "I'm on my own. Look after her." A moment of confusion passed between all three of them as they looked at one another uncomprehendingly. "What?" "Just do it, Padfoot." And before Cecilia's failing eyes, illuminated by the naked glare of the full moon, Sirius backed away from her as Remus Lupin howled. "Come on, you stupid idiot." Sirius pulled Snape's unflinching body away from the tree. Stumbling, Cecilia found herself being hauled away from Remus Lupin, now in full werewolf form, and towards a thick shrubbery. Pushing her roughly to the ground, he peered between the stubby branches of the hawthorn. "This wouldn't have happened if you—" He stabbed a finger in Cecilia's direction. Dash had made a wolf spin. "Now look at him. You've put us all in danger." With a swift kick in the ribs, he grinned horribly as Cecilia slumped to the ground again. "Sirius, you don't understand. That stupid mole, look what she's done. Harry's now in danger, and Dash." Sirius. But Cecilia's effort at explaining to Sirius his error was interrupted by a blood-curdling howl coming from much closer than she had anticipated. Her heart began to race, but her hands were growing colder. With effort, she knelt forward, wondering how she could get away. "And if you think you're running off into danger again, Snivellus, then you've got another think coming." Sirius held Cecilia's shoulder firmly, and she remained in her kneeling position as Sirius peered through the shrubbery branches again. Then, without warning, he took Snape's wrist, hauling her to her feet again. Cecilia swayed, trying to breathe, but in desperation began to hyperventilate. Sirius frowned scornfully, shaking her arm. "Gods, Snivellus, you really are a weak and foolish wizard. It was no wonder that your mole father dumped you here and moved in your first year. I know I would, if it meant getting you off my hands and Dash." Another howl. This time Lupin sounded even closer, and Sirius glanced furtively around, shaking her arm ferociously and lowering his voice. "If I don't murder you tonight, it won't be lack of trying. No one would have trouble believing that you succumbed to an accident." "Sirius." "What?" He looked, annoyed, at where Cecilia was pointing past him. A werewolf was staring at them. Remus, she thought desperately, recalling the deathly expression on his face moments ago. Was it really him? He knew it was her, didn't he? Hadn't he told Sirius to look after her? With supreme effort, Cecilia got unsteadily to her feet and began to move in the werewolf's direction. It reared up onto its hind legs, howling deep and macabrely. "Idiot! Get moving!" shouted Sirius, shaking Cecilia. "Come on!" he yelled as she stumbled, and he grabbed hold of Snape's forearm, out of the forest. Behind them, a few moments later, the werewolf began to give chase. 88,888,888. And now, as the war game began to get into its stride, the opponents evenly matched and the gaming space clear. The aforementioned observer would probably be quite satisfied that the rules of the game were being adhered to without risk of interruptions by now redundant pieces. The game could go on as planned, and the potential for the board to be upended by the family pet eliminated. For it was busy chasing two of the now redundant pieces towards the Humping Willow.